Welcome to the AI Decision Guy podcast, the show where we explore the intriguing balance between artificial intelligence and human decision making. I'm your host, Dr. Carlos Kemeny, and in each episode, we dive deep into the world of AI and its impact on various industries. Today, my guest is David Osborne. David is the Chief Sales Officer and has responsibility over global revenue at Insightly. Prior to joining Insightly, he spent 12 years at Qualtrics as one of the original employees and a founding member of the sales leadership team, scaling the business from less than $10 million in revenue to over $1 billion in revenue. All right, David, I'm so thrilled to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining today.
My pleasure, Carlos. Happy to be here.
Well, the thing that intrigues me about having you on the show is talking about your revenue, sales mindset and leadership. I mean, you've led incredible revenue organizations to incredible revenue milestones. I'd love to dig into the world of AI and how it's influencing decision making for sales leadership and how that permeates across the organization. So maybe to start there, tell me a little bit about how you're thinking about AI, how it's currently affecting maybe some of the decision-making processes that you have right now. And then we'll dive into, individual decision-making on your teams.
Sure. So I think AI obviously is a hot area right now, right? I mean, there's just so much innovation happening at such a rapid clip. Now, like as I zoom out and I think about sales and revenue teams, right? I think sales is kind of one of those unique groups in business that still is very, very uniquely human, right? When you're doing B2B sales, you're often interacting with human beings, right? And so, like that element, I think, is still to its core there, right? We're not necessarily automating the sales process. Where I think AI has really made things more efficient is just in the decision-making processes and cutting out some of the more tedious, mundane tasks, right? And there's a variety of different ways that that's happened. But, historically, when you're doing things like measuring pipeline or forecast, right, trying to identify trends and benchmarks, things like that, AI can take loads of time and energy from the RevOps teams in trying to deduce and find these different insights. And so that when you think about that decision-making funnel, as opposed to all of the due diligence that goes up front, we can skip that part and actually start to make some really thoughtful decisions, which I think just makes people's jobs far more effective and efficient. So I think in our realm, it's very, very exciting.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, right now we're in that stage of efficiency gains, right? Where, AI is there, just like what you're talking about. You have some data quality issues. You have exception-based reporting that currently is manually done. You have maybe sales desk teams or revenue operations that are set up to maybe cleanse data in specific ways so that it can be usable. And efficiencies, these are pretty inefficient processes, human. And yet at the same time, AI presents this great opportunity to automate a lot of that work, to augment that work, even things like creating prompts or different motions, and even the text within those motions that are personalized. How effective are those today, though? ChatGPT certainly should be an aid to every single person, but there's also the argument that, well, people can understand if you've used ChatGPT and now it becomes completely robotic. So how do you optimize that? How do you optimize the process in the inputs so that the output still at least is the same or better?
Well, I think it depends on the nature of the task, right? So I think if you're dealing with customers, right, for external facing things, I know it's very common for like marketing folks that help write copy, right, or some of the content they're putting together. Some of these AI systems can help accelerate that process. But I think the process of purchasing things, right, from a sales perspective, right, or interacting or making that human connection, right, like knowing who is Carlos, what are you passionate about, what are priorities for you and your business. AI is going to have a hard time deducing that, right, especially if you're a startup, right? You're not going to be able to garner that kind of information. And even if it could, it would have some amount of bias in it that you just need to account for. So I think in a lot of areas, like I said, but on the other side, for more internal back office stuff, right, we can be leveraging some of this analytics to help um, raise flags on issues that maybe would take a lot longer for a human to be able to identify. For example, forecasting or pipeline inaccuracies or relative customer health information. Those are things that typically take a little bit of time for a human being to be able to see that, wow, my house is on fire. I should probably address that. Whereas AI can be able to see that way before it's an issue and we can actually be proactively addressing it rather than waiting for the house to actually be burning and us reactively addressing it at that time. So it just depends on the nature of the task. But that's where, like I said, I typically think that there's a lot of things that will still require human interaction, but by leveraging technologies like AI, it's just making us far more efficient and and at a higher velocity than we normally could.
How does this change the leader in their development of the folks that are actually doing this on the lines? Well, part of the issue that we have is with this augmentation, this efficiency gain, is that labor should be expected to do more, right? There's this argument that with technological advance, the nature of people's jobs change, and the unit of labor then has more opportunity to to do this deeper work. And
Right.
we typically just kind of we overlook some of these things and say, oh yeah, it'll work itself out. But walk us through how this works as a leader. Do you expect, as there's more efficiency,
Yeah.
how do you now hold accountable a team? How do you elevate the requirements for what a unit of labor is to achieve with this augmentation?
Yeah. Well, I think the nature of the labor changes, right? I mean, when I think about when I started my career, um, the concept of building pipeline, for example, right, was a very manual process, right? But with the advent of different technologies, right, with like the Zoom infos and the LinkedIn's and a variety, I mean, that's not necessarily AI stuff, but like the manual aspect of going out and figure out which companies to call, who to contact, like that was a very laborious exercise, right? Making the phone calls, right? I mean, after COVID, we've seen there's a decent percentage of people that still haven't gone back to an office yet, right? And even if they do, they may not have a desk phone anymore. So you making cold calls like you did in 2005 is probably not the most efficient way to do it, right? So that's where you see things like it's not that building pipeline is no longer a requirement. It's just the nature of that exercise is different. It's far more efficient, it's far more automated, and you're able to cast a far wider net than we ever could in the past. So you're still responsible for doing the job, but the metrics and the accountability of that job have changed. Like the metrics of success. What does that look like? What do we expect of you? And actually, on that end, AI helps you derive those benchmarks at a far better clip than we could in the past, right? We could institute a policy and it could take us months to figure out what does good look like versus AI running different iterations and understanding like, well, I could tell you pretty quickly that if you do X, this input, you will get Y. Or if you incrementally improve X, you will see that much more output on the back end. So, it just makes us evolve and iterate at a far faster clip than we could the past, which is important because I feel like business is changing faster than ever, and we need that efficiency that to have that competitive edge.
How does this change the way that leaders set goals? Because I think that your point about AI being able to iterate very quickly then means that you have the ability to create personalized goals. That's
Mhm.
challenging. That's time intensive. What about policy on these types of compensation goals that are actually quite challenging to optimize when you deal with, various facets of these individuals on a team, tenure, and quality of deals from the pipe going to specific individuals, the traditional problems of sales
Right.
performance. How does this mitigate some of that, and how does the leader and the decision making around things like goals and good policy now elevate the importance of decisions from revenue and sales leadership?
Well, there's a couple ways to answer that question, but I kind of like the string that you were going with regards to like performance improvement, things like that. So let's tug on that. I would say more often than not, what ends up happening is a leader might give you more empathy, or like, I guess they just don't really raise the flag sooner. So I guess my answer would be, in a lot of ways it would help you avoid the relative bias that you may have on an individual, right? By saying, like, you're like, oh, it's not really that big of a deal, versus the data being like, no, it's actually a very big deal. And actually, let me quantify how big of a deal this is for you. And if you don't fix it now, this is the downstream effects that could happen. So, in some regards, like, when you're setting different goals or metrics, there's a certain element of human bias that you can leverage AI to validate, right? Like, this is where I think my strategic priority should be, but let's cross check that with AI, right? But there's a lot of other elements that, right, maybe we're so focused on a very specific item or topic that we just kind of let those other things happen, and then they fester to a point where then now that's in your face. So, kind of a long-winded answer, but I think there's kind of two ways to think about it. One is a validation that we're on the right track, which is honestly something that a lot of executives struggle with anyways. Is, I feel like I have a good handle on my business and these are the top 3 to 5 priorities, but you know how much do we how important is that compared to those ones? So the validation aspect is part one, but I also think that the proactive nature of, let's get ahead of this stuff before it really starts to fester is just as critical.
So let's talk about data trust a little
Okay.
bit, because I think, going and connecting these two strands where you have the previous paradigm where there's a lot of manual effort to build these pipelines, and you've
Sure.
talked through that. But the second piece, which is, okay, you have full automation, there's this concern for a lot of people where they stand today, which is even without AI or some platforms that offer AI, people still don't trust their data. Why
Hmm.
is this? What do you do about it? How important is it that you solve data quality issues prior to investing a great deal in AI? What are the bad things that are going to happen if you do that? Let's just go through those kind of thoughts and this uh, importance of data quality and building trust for the decision to be made at the end.
Sure. So I think there's again kind of two varying kind of thoughts on this. So I think the first thing is, um, fully understand, and I think everyone can respect the fact that AI and some of this machine learning is still relatively in its infancy, right? We're still early innings on this technology. And although it's innovating and progressing really rapidly, we still got a lot of things. We acknowledge the fact that we have a ways to go. That said, I think there's a legacy mindset that needs to be changed, that AI technologies are going to really quickly expose you on, which is, there's a lot of companies that have cultures that have somewhat of a victim mentality, right? They don't take ownership over the results, and accountability is very difficult, right? And so organizations that don't have that transparency or that culture of accountability are going to push back against it because they're actually being called out for very objective reasons, and they don't like it, and they're going to push back against it. But you, as an executive, you got to decide, what kind of company do we want to run? Do we want to be a statistics based, a metric based driven business, or do we want to run on opinions, right? But the problem with opinions is we could both have them, right? Which one is right? And so there's going to be that distrust, but I think there's also just an element of accountability and building the culture of what you want, that you got to decide, what side of the coin do I want to be on? Because by enabling AI and some of these technologies, you're going to surface things that are going to be uncomfortable, and you're going to have uncomfortable conversations with people. But are those the things we want to do? Are we willing to do that to build a great business? I would say yes, but it's a hard question that I think a lot of people got to ask themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think accountability, what a great word. I mean, I think that this is a key to some of the successes or failures of companies. And I think that when you look at, let's say, the revenue side of the coin and connecting that to other parts of the business, we'll say product and engineering, right? You have this relationship that oftentimes is strained, where you have feedback that's being given on why deals are being lost coming from the sales org to product and engineering. And the goal of that is to prioritize these features to make it easier to sell.
Mhm.
That's a very important connection. That's a very important feedback loop. Is that alive and well today in organizations? And where people are doing it well, what are they doing well? And for those that are not doing it well, what are they not doing well? And then we'll get into the AI, how does AI help solve that? But let's start there.
So I think relative to like the revenue teams working with product teams, there's always going to be that kind of give and take, right? Because product and eng teams have their roadmap that they're trying to have some sort of conviction and commitment around. Meanwhile, the go-to-market teams are trying to close deals, right? And so there's always that balance of trade of how much are we willing to deviate from the roadmap in order to bring in this large deal or several large deals. So I guess put another way, there's an element of politics that kind of comes into that that's always been there, right? That I think again coming back to culture, you got to have that culture of communication and transparency, right? But I think where AI comes into place is in the documentation and the validation of this is a worthwhile endeavor versus this is something that is very esoteric to maybe that particular company that's not going to give us the force multiplier that we hope if we go about doing this decision. So it helps eliminate the bias, the human bias that comes in making these decisions, where you may have a hell of a salesperson, right, that can put a really great business case together. But when you actually look at the objective metrics and actually what the outputs are going to be, maybe it's really not worth our time. Um, and not only that, in my experience, salespeople are emotional people, right? They get really excited about things and they're going to use emotion to hopefully even if you're like an enterprise B2B seller, you're going to do it. Um, but it'll also, I think when used properly can help that salesperson build a better business case than they could before. Maybe they had a silver tongue before, but now they have a silver tongue and a whole bunch of information and data to help validate the stance that I think if you're bringing it to a product or eng team, they should really take a long, hard look at that. More often than not, when you lose that argument as a salesperson, it's because you couldn't properly quantify the impact for the customer, for the business. Like, is this something that could be replicated and leveraged for more customers, or is this just to this one? So I think it's one of those that you just got to embrace, right? Use it to your advantage. Because if you don't, I think you're going to get left behind. Like eventually, that way of doing things, of just trying to kind of bulldog your way into getting something done, those days are coming to an end, I suspect.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think that the nice part of AI in many ways is that oftentimes today someone prepares a story and they pitch that story. There's an objective for sharing that story, and there's effort that goes into collecting that data. To counter that, a lot of times people will use very uh, you know how should we say it, verifiable with the time that you have
Mhm.
information or arguments. For
Mhm.
example, I don't trust that, or the data's not clean. And how do you hold accountable someone in a meeting that says that, and then it's not qualified? Well, tell me more. This is the nature, I think, of how the boardroom or the executive room changes a bit. Is that when you use these types of arguments that are unfounded, that are emotionally based, very rarely do you have time to then dig in. But with
Yep.
AI, you can equally ask that question and understand if that's a validated statement or not. In fact, I wonder if in these executive decisions, there is kind of this view on a ChatGPT to check and verify unfounded statements. How beneficial would that be? Is that feasible? Is that something that you see will be a part of these types of discussions in the future?
I think it's a game changer because you're exactly right, right? You're in a board meeting or you're in an executive meeting and someone brings up an issue, right? And they make it sound like it's a really painful thing. But to your point, we don't really have a good way to qualify that, how legitimate that is. And even if we did, it could take us weeks to figure that out. So you end up almost having to take their word for it, which look, there's got to be a trust element in business, but again, just because it's really painful in your world doesn't mean it's a really big priority for the entirety of the business that we should stop everything and go. So look, I think it's hypercritical because again, the speed in which business is changing and evolving is so fast that rarely are you going to have time to just pause and do this due diligence for the next 2 to 3 weeks, right? We need a faster way to kind of iterate on these things. And to your point, like there is a garbage in, garbage out mentality, and it may never be absolutely perfect. But when you just think about the decision making cycle, if we could take it from 3 weeks to 3 days or 3 days to 3 hours, what could that do for you and your business? I mean, it it's almost unknowable at this point, right? So that's where I think it's a game changer, right? And those that are slow playing it, I mean, I get it, but I mean, it's getting good really, really quick, and the efficiencies gained are pretty astounding.
I like this. And I feel like you're validating an important aspect of how decisions are made in executive settings. It's interesting how the pathway of decision making goes in these meetings. Somebody says something, and then you either go down that path or you don't. And you only have so much time. And because of that, you either take them for their word and it takes you down a rabbit hole, or it leads to an action and you just move. This bias to action is such a critical element of business today. And so unfounded statements are pretty harmful at this point, and yet we don't have the ability really to check and to verify. And in fact, there is a quote I'd like to read. So Eric Schmidt and Henry Kissinger put out a op-ed piece about ChatGPT, seminal, important, critical article for everyone to read in the Wall Street Journal. And one of the thoughts, the provoking questions that they ask us is the following: can we develop an interrogatory mode capable of questioning the veracity and limitations of a model's answers, even when we do not know the answers ahead of time? And so, does this lend itself then to a fact checker in the boardroom or a fact checker in the executive meeting, that basically anytime someone says something and it's wrong, there's a little red light that goes off? Is this the world that we start living in? Is this what AI is going to do for us in real time to prevent against these rabbit holes that are unproductive, that tend to lead us to wrong places?
I think it absolutely does. I think it absolutely does. And having been in that room or having been one of those people that have deliberated on those decisions, and at some point you just got to make a call, and sometimes it's right and sometimes it's wrong. And not saying AI is going to make completely de-risk the situation, but to that end, it could also quantify what is the margin of error that you could experience by doing it. Actually could quantify your risk to some degree. So I think it's that. I think it's the velocity in which we can action or we can action different processes or programs. But I think it's also one of those that if you're walking into a board meeting or walking into an executive meeting and you don't have a good grasp on your business from a metrics and a data perspective, you could really quickly and easily get exposed, right? The days of being able to hide behind different walls are over, right? And it's historically been hard for sales or marketers because that's a very quantitative driven business. But as you and I were talking about before, like product teams, eng teams, those can be really hard to measure success or to identify gaps or different things. And so it's it will certainly accelerate the decision making process, but people also need to be prepared for the fact that you better have a very, very thorough and granular understanding of your business and what is going well and what are the gaps. Because if you don't, this data is going to be able to expose you pretty quickly, and you got to have an answer quickly on the spot if you're in a board level setting. So
Yes, yeah, this lends itself to, in the preparation for these meetings, that you yourselves are anticipating those questions. Perhaps you're even leaning on AI to anticipate questions that are being asked. And therefore, your preparation, your responses, and certainly there's an emotional component that we're talking about. But I'd like to talk about the decisions that will be displaced versus the ones that won't. Where in the world of the sales marketing, leadership, but also just generally in a company, what decisions aren't going to be displaced in your opinion? What are the things that gaps that prevent AI from replacing a human? Where are the gaps right now in these efficiencies where it's obvious to replace human decisions for? Is that hiring decisions? Is that promotion decisions? Are you reluctant as a leader to allow AI in your sleep to push a button on who's getting promoted this quarter? Are you reluctant
Yeah.
to generate content in your sleep, just automated A/B tests? What requires a human? What doesn't right now? What are the decisions that you think get displaced?
I think it depends on the relative nature of how much context do we need to make this decision. Does this machine, have all the variables and all the context required to be able to understand and lend itself to be making said decision? Um, I think there's a spectrum of items that it's. I look at that uh, is AI going to influence the decision or make the decision, right? And I actually suspect that AI will influence a ton of decisions, and by doing so, just eliminating a lot of the tedious manual effort that went into doing it, thus making a faster and more well informed decision. You brought up hiring; that's a great example. Like, there's a lot of bias that goes into an interview, right? But if you can, I mean, there's a lot of, and by the way, there's a lot of variables to consider. And a lot of them are going to be very specific to the role being hired, to the culture that you have. I think a machine will have a hard time doing that in the near term, right? Like, they may be able to determine the hard skills. Do you have X experience? Like, have you had, can you do these, objective measures? But there's a lot of other soft things that I think a machine will have a hard time to measure in the interim that a human will definitely need to. I mean, I brought up sales to begin with. We've seen, a lot more accelerated sales cycles, but I mean, even at the enterprise level, I still suspect that to be a human level decision if you're going to procure a piece of technology or not, right? I don't know that a machine is going to replace account executives anytime soon. I suspect sales should be safe for some time, but I could be wrong. But I look at that; it's less about replacing and doing the task, but more about augmenting and influencing those tasks to be better, faster, more effective.
Yeah. So is this something like a Google Glass, or some glasses solution or some visibility on the screen that says, hey, here are the three prompts that you could take. Here's the preferred, discount that you might offer. And it's now information that's orienting you through colors or highlights on the screen during an ongoing conversation that's reading the language and has information about the individual that allows you to synthesize in some uh, uh, you know standardized way across the Salesforce to your
Mhm.
tone, to your voice. And now it even projects, or maybe it takes your voice and animates it, if you're too mundane in your voice, or things like this. But I think that, like, from a standpoint of augmentative human connection, is this kind of where we're going? Is this kind of this piece? Because there is a value to a hug. A hug is still a
Yes.
hug.
Well said.
There is something about a hug, or there's something about connecting with an individual off script. And people don't like too robotic responses. I think
Yep.
yesterday I was in a panel and we talked about an apology from an athlete about some big thing that happened in the NBA, and this person apparently used a script that felt very ChatGPT like. And this was rejected by a lot of people, which is funny because in PR athletics, there's always a statement that everybody puts out that's the exact same statement. It's, I
Right.
take accountability for my actions. Well, of course, you're a human, right? So, like, but I think that from that standpoint, what's the difference between somebody using that template versus now ChatGPT probably produced it and therefore they must not have intent? This is a bit of a parallel, right? Where humans want to connect with humans, yet it's interesting how we position that in the moment that we're in, and
Mhm.
how people start scrutinizing whether something was robotic produced or not, and how this
Mhm.
matters in how we then take things. So does that mean that we start creating some error or little indications that we're human as a part of, like, signaling that there's some human connection there? This is a long-winded way of asking, like, what is the way to optimize a human relationship in an augmented world where people are looking for that, for authenticity?
I think it's a really great question, and I'm not an expert necessarily, but I would say that human interaction is kind of what makes a sales cycle real and legit, and that's why I don't necessarily see it being completely stripped away from a human being, because I do think we aspire to have that human connection, and it's It's interesting you bring up that NBA player story, because I would imagine ChatGPT put forward a statistically strong statement, right? That if you read on paper, probably was a very well written piece of content, but people could smell the BS coming through the camera or whatever medium, the podcast or whatever that was, and that's that human element that we're missing, right? He said all the right things, and yet it didn't go well. And think about how much that happens maybe in a sales cycle. We checked all the boxes, we met all the requirements, and yet they still went with the other vendor. Why? A lot of times you get out, I mean, being outsold is kind of building that human to human interaction, which is super critical. So I don't know that I necessarily subscribe to AIs, substituting people's voices to put together sales programs. When I think about these pitches, I still see those being a very human interaction. But where I see, different items that are prone to error, for a big one that revenue leaders see is forecasting. There's so much art and science that goes into forecasting that would be an element that is top 5 most important things that revenue leaders need to really master, that AI can really lend itself. So by embracing those types of utilizations and use cases, I think that's where we're going to see a lot more momentum versus having a robot do your sales pitch. I don't know that we're necessarily close to that, and I don't know that we'll want to be. I think that to your point, I think we want a hug, but we'll see. I mean, it's still early.
This is great. David, thanks for the time today. I mean, any final thoughts on the world of decision making and AI and in the world that you see?
Look, I think in the world of sales, it's often a legacy culture, right? Like, we've always done it this way. This is the way we've been doing it for 20 years. And I think we're at an interesting inflection point, especially if you're in, like a SaaS or a tech environment where we have so much data at our fingertips, right? There's so many different things that we have to leverage, that if you don't embrace some of these or leverage this in some capacity, I think you're going to get left behind. Like, I suspect that if you're not doing it, your competitors are, and they're going to outpace you. So I'm not saying you need to be all in, but I am saying this is a really, really critical moment in time where efficiency matters in business. And so do yourself a favor, do some research, do some due diligence, figure out what elements could prop up kind of your business and your cycle. And I wish you the best of luck.
Thanks, David. You heard it here. I'm grateful for David. Thank you for these fantastic thoughts. Thanks for the insights, the thoughts on what we're going to see. So thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Carlos.
Thank you for joining us on the AI Decision Guy podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our show, and be sure to tune in to our future episodes as we continue to explore the ever-evolving landscape of AI and its impact on decision-making. Until next time.